For this episode, we're taking a break from our regularly scheduled programming to bring you a Halloween special edition of the Occasional Podcast. That's right, the show is wrapped in a true crime podcast costume this week, but be forewarned, some might find the topic of today's podcast extremely disturbing and upsetting. No joke, friends, this one's painted with real-life horror. Today's episode of the Occasional Podcast is brought to you by HiFi Rose. HiFi Rose streamers give you a beautiful, intuitive interface, sleek design, and incredible sound quality from your digital music library and favorite streaming services, such as Apple Music, Tidal, Qobuz, and more. There really isn't anything else like HiFi Rose, which is why it is the streamer of choice for audiophiles all over the world. Visit HiFiRoseUSA.com to find your nearest retailer or order online. The future of music awaits you. Today's episode is also brought to you by Woo Audio. The Woo Audio WA23 Luna headphone amplifier is engineered to deliver an impressive sound experience with an ingenious design that is not the typical audio gear black box. The amplifier is an all-tube, pure analog circuit, operating in Class A mode for a powerful, balanced sound, outstanding stereo separation, and a wide bandwidth across all frequencies, so you hear every note in the recording. No matter what music you enjoy, WA23 Luna delivers Woo Audio's commitment to a natural sound that is non-fatiguing for all-day listening. Learn more at wooaudio.com. That's WOOAUDIO.com, where better sound begins.
Well, it's considered one of the most heinous crimes in Utah history. In 1974, the city of Ogden was shocked to find 3 people murdered and 2 others brutally tortured, but somehow survived inside of the HiFi electronics store. Now, 45
What you're hearing is a local newscast from a TV affiliate out of Utah. The segment, called The Justice Files, focused on one of the state's most infamous crimes. These crimes are almost 50 years old now, but the lore of what happened lived on. Not because some of the perpetrators were never caught, or because the thievery was so brazen. No, the reason these crimes live on in the American psyche can be described by one word: brutality. And when that crime is murder, especially in a small town, those wounds might never heal. Today we dive deep into one of the industry's darkest days. This is an occasional examination of the HiFi murders. We sat down with co-host Bryan Beasley to talk about the crime, the victims, and the criminals that shook the high-fidelity world. Mr. Bryan Beasley, happy Halloween. How are you these days?
Happy Halloween, Mr. Brian Hunter. The 2 Bryans ride again, like the 4 horsemen. I guess there's only 2 of us, though. Happy Halloween to you, too. I'm so glad we're back doing this.
Do me a favor, set the scene about what exactly happened with this whole HiFi murders.
You bet. So basically, we're in Ogden, Utah in 1974. And Ogden is basically a suburb of Salt Lake City, just about 40 miles north. And in the 70s, they had a population of around 70,000. Big enough to have everything you need, but still, maintaining that small town feel. On one of these main streets sat the HiFi shop at 2323 Washington Boulevard. And this was your go-to store for all your HiFi needs. Monday, April 22nd, 1974 was a day like any other. There were 2 employees working the shop that day. We had Stanley Walker, who was 20, and Sherry Michelle Ansley, who was age 18. Stanley was very active in the community. He considered himself a youth leader in the LDS church. Stanley was not even supposed to be working that day, but the storage manager was away at a convention. You guys in your conventions in the HiFi world,
yeah.
Right? So young Stanley was in charge, right? We had Sherry, who had only been working at the HiFi shop for a week. And the big news in her life was that she had just gotten engaged over the weekend. So I'm sure a big LDS wedding was almost certainly front and center in her mind. Like Stanley, she wasn't even supposed to be working on this beautiful spring day. She was filling in for another employee. So that kind of already sets the stage of something tragic, right? That we have
Right.
these two young people, 20 and 18, and they're not even supposed to be there. The store was quiet on that Monday, not too many customers, but 16-year-old Courtney Nesbitt did stop by. Courtney had come in, not to buy anything. He simply came in to ask if he could park his car in the shop's back parking lot while he ran out errands on the main street there. Stanley, our now acting manager, let him know it'd be no problem.
"20-year-old Stanley Walker, 18-year-old Sherry Michelle Ansley, and 16-year-old Courtney Nesbitt. 3 young lives from 3 families within this small community were about to be marred by tragedy. Unbeknownst to them, 2 vans holding 6 thieves were en route to the HiFi store to rob it. Among the group was a ringleader, 19-year-old William Andrews. It was his idea to rob the shop, and he was pretty sure he had the connections to move the stolen merchandise. Keith Roberts was one of the drivers. And finally, there was 21-year-old Dale Shelby Pierre. What Andrews and Roberts didn't fully comprehend is when they partnered with Pierre, they brought along a severely troubled, cold-blooded killer. Simply put, Shelby Pierre was a man of extreme ill intent. Okay, Brian, tell me a little bit more about the characters in this tragedy.
This whole thing comes down to Dale Shelby Pierre. And a little bit about his backstory. Pierre grew up on the island of Trinidad. Later, he moved to Brooklyn before joining the Air Force in 1973 and being stationed in Utah. Pierre was known to have a short fuse and a quick temper. So he was only in the Air Force for a little while when, listen to this part, he became a suspect in the murder of a Sergeant Edward Jefferson.
Really?
Yeah. So apparently Pierre stole Jefferson's keys, duplicated them with the idea that he'd, I guess robbed Jefferson at some later date. Jefferson found out and he confronted Pierre. So get this, Brian. Jefferson would soon be found in his apartment, murdered by bayonet.
A bayonet, like the knife at the end of a gun?
Exactly. There was not enough physical evidence to bring charges against Pierre, but the cops there in Ogden were pretty sure that he'd done it. They say the perpetrator of the crime had jammed the long knife with such ferocity into Jefferson's face and head that only the handle could be seen. Okay, so basically, Pierre had no regard for human life.
It would be at Utah's Hill Air Force Base that mechanics Dale Shelby Pierre and William Andrews would meet. After a year in the service, the two filed for separation from the Air Force with their commanding officer. Somewhere along the line, these 2 very dangerous men decided that they would chase a life of crime. The first of what they assumed would be many hold-up jobs was the HiFi store on Washington Boulevard.
So now we basically have the crime. We have this gang of men that have all met. They're all mechanics. They'd all met at Hill Air Force Base. 6 men in 2 vans. They arrive right before the HiFi store is about to close. William Andrews, Dale Shelby Pierre, and a 3rd man enter the store, and they brandish handguns and immediately take Stanley Walker, our acting manager, and Sherry Michelle Ansley captive. They take the 2 to the storage basement and bind their hands and feet. As they are doing this, Courtney Nesbitt, the guy who had just parked in the back to run errands, walks in to thank Stanley for letting him park in the back. And he is immediately taken hostage and tied up downstairs as well. So the heist is basically underway at this point. They clean out the cash register and they take all the high-end HiFi equipment. They load it up in 2 vans waiting at the back loading dock. All told, they get about $5,300. And that's basically $30,000 in today's money, which amongst the 6 of them, that's basically a $5,000 cut, which isn't like the crime of the century, right?
Yeah.
Once the first van is loaded, the 3 unidentified men leave.
Unidentified men? You're saying after all of this, 3 men remain unidentified from the heist?
Yeah, it is a crazy kind of like small footnote about this whole circumstance, this whole crime, is that we've got 6 people involved in the crime and only 3 of them have ever been identified. There's a lot of theories that go on out there. One theory is that one might have been an informant. Most likely, this was just the 70s. There was no video, no DNA. Maybe literally the small town police department just couldn't solve it. But it does seem kind of odd that after 50 years, one of the 3 men that they did identify and did prosecute wouldn't have given up the other 3 guys. I mean, who knows? They were all in the Air Force. Maybe one of these three identified people had high-up connections and the Air Force itself covered it up. It could be something as simple as they couldn't figure it out. It could be something as nefarious as the police department, the town, the Air Force, someone covered it up. But at the end of the day, there are three men that were involved in this crime that have never been identified. And that is a little disheartening, if you ask me.
And that's kind of unusual, isn't it? Because in today's court systems, generally speaking, if there's a heist or a crime that is involved with a murder, everyone involved in the crime gets prosecuted for the murder.
100%. If you go in and rob a bank and you kill a teller or a guard, the guy who's sitting in the car, the getaway driver, is accountable for those murders. So again, this was 1974. Maybe some of the laws that we are accustomed to now with this kind of stuff, this was like the beginning of that. It's still very unusual and really odd that we have three men that were never identified, especially once we get into the murders and just how infamous this case is, that those three guys weren't, identified at all this many years later. It's odd. So basically that leaves William Andrews, Dale Shelby Pierre in the store with the hostages and our getaway driver, Keith Roberts, waiting in the van.
At this point, considerable time has passed since the store should have been closed, and the family members of Stanley Walker and Courtney Nesbitt begin to worry about the tardiness of their loved ones. When the phone at the HiFi store went unanswered, it prompted the father of Stanley Walker to drive over. He entered through the unlocked front door. Soon after, the mother of Courtney Nesbitt arrived, saw her son's parked car at the HiFi shop, and she too entered the store. Both were greeted by armed culprits and were soon tied up and bound on the basement floor as well. It was only then that Pierre and Andrews decided it would be a good idea to lock the front door.
So here we are. Moment of truth, right? We have 5 hostages. Acting store manager Stanley Walker and his father, 43-year-old Orrin Walker. There's Courtney Nesbitt, who was just there using the parking space, and now his mother, 52-year-old Carol Nesbitt, and the newest HiFi employee, Sherry Michelle Ansley. Basically, none of these people were even supposed to be there. It was at this moment that Pierre and Andrews, they crossed a line that they would never return. Brian, I've got a friend who's a federal prosecutor. I remember him telling me once that, the genius criminals that you always see in the movies, the ones that always have it all figured out, they don't exist. An overwhelming majority of the criminals he prosecuted would never be confused with being smart. But it's the ones that are particularly ignorant. Those were the ones that were the most dangerous because repercussions never fully entered into the equation. It never even entered into their mind that they could be held accountable for whatever horrible things they were about to do. It's through this ignorance that brings us to the B movie, Magnum Force.
Eastwood is back in full force as Dirty Harry and Magnum Force.
The 1973 Dirty Harry movie, Magnum Force, starring Clint Eastwood, depicts a scene where the killer forces a woman to drink drain cleaner. In the film, the victim instantly keels over and dies. At some point before the robbery, Pierre saw this film and took notice that Drano was a perfect and quiet murder weapon. Drano is a household drainage cleaner made from bleach and lye. It works to create a chemical reaction to decompose organic matter. It is, in fact, not a perfect murder weapon, as large amounts must be ingested and can take hours to be lethal. However, Drano is instantly a very effective torture device. Hello, listeners. What comes next is a description of very graphic violence and may be a trigger for some people. If you wish to skip ahead 3 minutes and 15 seconds, you can go straight to how the case resolves. Otherwise, this is what happened.
So let's get into it, Brian. We have 5 hostages. We have the psycho, Pierre, and the mastermind, Andrews. Pierre tells the 5 hostages that the liquid in the brown paper bag was vodka laced with sleeping pills. This would knock them out and prevent them from calling for help so that they could make their escape. One by one, the victims were forced to drink what was basically a cup of Drano. The victims immediately received second-degree burns on their lips, their mouths, and their throats. They began coughing, and they began screaming in pain. Screaming so loudly that Andrews tried to cover their mouths with duct tape, but the adhesive would not stick to the victims' peeling and melting skin, and the tape simply slid off their faces.
That just seems really over the top. I mean,
Yeah.
Why didn't they just wear ski masks like in a regular robbery?
It is the question, right? Like, why did they have to kill them? Like, why were they trying to kill them? It doesn't even make sense. It was a financially motivated crime. There's no reason to escalate to this kind of horror. In fact, decades later, when pressed on motive, Andrews himself would say, "I was just 19. Who knows what I was thinking?"
It soon dawns on Pierre and Andrews that the Drano was working far too slowly, and the screams of the victims could be alerting the outside world to the basement of horrors these two had created. Pierre turned to his .25 caliber handgun. According to court testimony, Andrews declared he was too scared and went upstairs to leave the killer to his work.
So here we are. We have all 5 of the hostages lying on the floor and writhing in agony. The Drano basically doing its damnedest and worst on them, but not killing them. Pierre starts with the executions. He shoots Carol Nesbitt in the back of the head. He then shoots her son, Courtney Nesbitt, in the back of his head. Pierre tries to shoot Orrin Walker, but the bullet grazes his head, missing him. Pierre then shoots Orrin's son, Stanley Walker, in the head, killing him instantly. The murderer Pierre then turns his attention to 18-year-old Sherry Michelle Ansley, who by now has retained consciousness and spit up most of the Drano. Pierre gets her to her feet. He calls up to Anders not to come down for 30 minutes. He then takes her to the far corner of the basement. Pierre sexually assaults Ansley, and once finished, brings her back to the group and shoots her dead in the back of the head. Andrews is called down by Pierre. He takes the wallets and other possessions from the bodies, and it's at this time that Andrews realizes that Orrin Walker is still breathing, and the bullet had missed killing him. It had just grazed him. Pierre takes a length of wire and tries to strangle Orrin, but he can't get the right desired grip on the wire. Instead, Pierre grabs a ballpoint pen and shoves it into Orrin Walker's ear. He then stomps the pen into Orrin's head. The pen breaks through Orrin's eardrum, then angles downward, puncturing a hole in his throat. Orrin was left to bleed out on the basement floor.
Pierre and Andrews were finally satisfied that they had done away with any witnesses to the HiFi robbery. They fled in the van waiting outside, driven by Keith Roberts. 3 hours later, Stanley Walker's brother, Len Walker, breaks down the back door of the shop after hearing moans coming from inside. He quickly finds the victims in the basement. His father, Orrin, was gravely wounded but alive, having sustained burns to his mouth and chin, damage to his ear and throat, and a slight wound on the back of his head from where the bullet had grazed him. His brother, Stanley Walker, was dead from a single gunshot wound to the head. Sherry Ansley had also died from a gunshot wound. Carol Nesbitt was taken by ambulance to St. Benedict's Hospital. She was pronounced dead on arrival. Her son, Courtney Nesbitt, had survived drinking the drain cleaner and the gunshot to the head, but it would take 266 days in the hospital and multiple surgeries to save his life. He suffered irreparable brain damage. That night, a press release went out on the wire. The details of the murders hit the early morning press. The hunt was on.
So basically, Brian, there are 2 major breaks in the case that came in immediately. Hours after the news of the crime broke, an anonymous Air Force employee called the Ogden police and told them that Andrews had confided in him months earlier that one of these days I'm going to rob the HiFi shop, and if anyone gets in my way, I'm going to kill them. Brian, going back to those unidentified other people, one of them might have been the person that ratted them out, not knowing that the murders were going to take place after they left with the stolen merchandise. But we'll never know. The next morning, 2 teenage boys dumpster diving at Hill Air Force Base, near the barracks Pierre and Andrews were living, contacted the police after discovering the victims' wallets and purses. Responding officer Detective Deloy White, believing that the killers might be in the crowd, put on a show for the gathering airmen. He waved each piece of evidence in the air with tongs as he removed it from the dumpster. He he noticed that most of the service personnel who gathered around the dumpsters simply stood and watched, with the exception of 2 men who paced around the crowd, speaking loudly and making frantic gestures. I think you know where we're going with this, Brian. The 2 men, of course, were Pierre and Andrews, and they were quickly taken in for questioning.
So they went back to check out their handiwork? What were they doing?
I mean, these guys were not smart. So, complete side note, Brian, this is kind of the first time that this investigative technique was used, that the victims may want to come see their handiwork while the police are on site and kind of watch these detectives put a case against them. So for many reasons, this case is actually taught at the FBI Academy in Quantico of listen, if there's a big show going on, there's a crowd gathering, the people that might have perpetrated the crime might actually be in that crowd. It's also where crime photographers will actually take pictures. They'll take wide-angle photos of the crowd in hopes that maybe they'll capture a killer in the crowd. And on this day, it's exactly what Detective White was able to do. A search warrant was then issued for their barracks, and police found flyers for the HiFi shop, which isn't that unusual. But the clue that broke the case open, a rental contract for a public storage unit.
Police quickly moved in on the storage facility in question, and surprise, surprise, they discovered the stolen sound equipment and a half-empty bottle of drain cleaner. Given that only half a bottle was split between 5 people, it's no wonder that drinking it didn't kill all the victims outright, but merely tortured and disfigured them. This is the way that more basic criminals can sometimes be the most dangerous ones. Pierre and Andrew's poor planning concerning the robbery and murder achieved nothing but a larger degree of suffering for their victims, while not getting rid of all the witnesses as they had originally planned. It took a jury less than 90 minutes to hand down a punishment of death to both Dale Shelby Pierre and William Andrews. Getaway driver Keith Roberts would spend 13 years in prison for the robbery, and he took his own life in 1992. 3 other men who took part in the robbery, but not the murders, have never been identified.
Good morning, I'm Susan Furness. In news this morning, after nearly 18 years and scores of failed appeals, death row inmate William Andrews was executed by lethal injection at 1:46 this morning.
William Andrews, the initiator behind the HiFi robbery, was put to death on July 30th, 1992. He was 37. The troubled convicted murderer, Dale Shelby Pierre, who would later change his name to Dale Shelby, was put to death by lethal injection on August 28th, 1987. He was 34.
In the years following the HiFi murders, a lot of people in Ogden did come to understand that it did happen in their hometown. KUTV's Rod Arquette is in Ogden tonight with more on Ogden's day after. Rod?
Well, Randall, there were mixed emotions here in Ogden today, of course, about Pierre Dale Selby's execution. It's hard to find anybody here who did not want to see Dale Selby die. They also want William...
The victims. Stanley Walker, age 20, Sherry Michelle Ansley, age 18, and Carol Nasbitt, age 52, all died of their wounds on April 22nd, 1974. Courtney Nasbitt, 16 at the time of the attack, suffered chronic pain for the rest of his life and died on June 4th, 2002. He was 44. Orrin Walker, who was forced to watch the murder of his son, became the star witness for the prosecution. He clearly identified Pierre and Andrews, testifying on their unrelenting cruelty, sealing the 2 criminals' fate, and ultimately, demise. He died on February 13th, 2000. He was 69. The Occasional Podcast is a production of the Part-Time Audiophile Network, which includes parttimeaudiophile.com, The Occasional Magazine, the PTA newsletter, and audiohead.com. You can stay in touch with us on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube. The Occasional Podcast is produced and hosted by Brian Hunter, executive produced by Scott Hall at PTA Productions. The Occasional Podcast and its original associated music is monitored, mixed, and mastered on the Focal Trio 6 BE studio monitors. If you haven't already, please subscribe to the Occasional Podcast on iTunes, Google, Spotify, or wherever your favorite podcasts are downloaded.